Hey guys, Keith here. All right, a release update video. I'm going to cover versions 23 through to 27. A number of releases here, many of them in short sequence due to some of the complexities that we've encountered and some stupid errors, but whatever. So I'm going to go through the features. I'll cover off the xSchedule ones first because there's only a couple of those, and then we'll get into all the xLights ones, and some of those are quite involved. So let's get started with xSchedule. So there's really two changes to xSchedule. One is there are some new commands, and I've set up a couple of buttons with these commands, and you can also use these from external things, the APIs available. So one is play the specified playlist if it's not running. And so this allows you to set up, in this case, I've set up a button to play this playlist, and it will only restart or play that playlist if that playlist is not already running. So if you want to set up a button for your guests to press, and you've got your Christmas show and you want them to be able to press the button and start your Christmas show, but if they press the button again, you don't want it to restart the show again, you want it to just continue to play the show as it was, then this is how you would, this is the sort of command that you would use. There's also this one down here, which is play the specified playlist if nothing is running. So in that case, if you've got another playlist running and you press this button, it won't interrupt the current playlist to play the other one, whereas this one up here will interrupt a different playlist playing to play it. So let me show you how that works. So I got a playlist here. I'll just kick it off. Hopefully you won't be able to hear the audio. So it's now playing. You can see the time's advancing. If I click on the XXX button, it will jump up and play my playlist. So it will interrupt it and play it, because that one said to play that playlist if it wasn't already running. If I click it again, notice how it doesn't stop. It just keeps going, no matter how many times I click it. All right. And if I click Y now, also nothing will happen. And the reason nothing is happening is because that playlist is playing, and this one will only play when I press the Y button. Sorry, this one up here will only play if nothing else is running. So if I click it now, it will start the playlist. But if I click it again, it won't do anything. And neither will this one, because the same playlist is already playing. So it just gives you the ability to tell the scheduler to do something without having to worry about some details. The other quick change I made was in events. And this is really a copy of something that I introduced into Xfade. So when you have the MIDI events, it used to be you had to go and work out all of these channels and numbers and everything. And the only way really to do it was to look in the log, where I used to log everything out. So now I've introduced the scan button. And if you press the scan button, what it does is it goes and looks at the keyboard. And when you press a button, which I just did, you can see that it's actually read which button was pressed and pre-populated all the fields. So now setting those events up is as simple as pressing the scan button, clicking the button that you want to associate with it. And in this case, you have to give it a name, and then the OK becomes enabled, and you can create the event. So something to make setting up MIDI events just a little bit easier. So that's it for xSchedule. Not a lot of changes. Just a handful. So let's switch over to xLights, which means we have to, oh no, it's running, here it is. Okay, I'm going to change directories. I'm going to go and create a new directory. Select, okay. And let's throw a matrix in there, because it's always good to show things on a matrix. And let's start at the bottom and work our way through. Fixing the square wave to make it recognize. Okay, so there were a number of problems with the square wave effect, and so I've made some changes. It's still possible to produce the same effect as it had previously, although you may need to make a couple of minor tweaks with it because it was ignoring some things. So if you set it to the square wave now, it does produce a proper square wave. And if you change the thickness of the wave, you can see how it makes the thickness of the wave bigger, and you can scale it up and so forth. The other reason I did that is because now you can mirror the wave. Now, mirroring a square wave doesn't make a huge amount of sense. It produces some fairly weird and not very helpful results, but at least it's now consistent with all of the other effects in terms of what it looks like. I doubt very many people are using square wave, but yeah, there's some minor tweaks to that which fix some things up. Adding a Y offset to the wave effect. What this is there's just an extra parameter now down here, which is the Y offset, which allows you to move the wave up or down. That doesn't just apply to square wave. Of course, that applies to all of the waves. You can move them up or down on the display. So just an additional option. These ones here, I'll show you what I can. So Gil's been working on the VSA. There was some challenges that people were having, and so what he's done is he's made some changes to the DMX model for the skull. The Skulltronic skull, yes. Okay, so he's gone and tidied these things up. There were some additional discussions that Gil was having with the guys that make this stuff and configure it, and so he's gone and made a bunch of changes. So he's changed all the default channel assignments. There was some things that he was doing with some of the lower channels, and anyway, he's cleaned all of that up. I won't go into the details of it. Most people that start playing with this stuff end up reaching out to Gil at some point to get a better understanding of how it works. He's also he's added the default node names. What does that mean? I think that's if you go into here, yeah. So he's gone into here and he's put some default node names in against each of the channels. And that's useful because when it comes time for you to sequence the skull, when you open the model up, down here, you can see all of the channels and what they do, and you can drop effects directly on them if that's what you wanted to do. So yeah, he's done that. And the DMX panel to 40 channels. Now, I think what that means, I'm pretty sure, let me have a quick check, is if I grab the DMX effect up here, yeah, you can see it used to say, I think 1 to 9 and 10 to 18. Well, now it goes all the way up to 40. So you can now control a 40 channel prop using the DMX effect without having to drop additional DMX effects or things on it or create to shadow models, etc. to do that. Mind you, there are some models out there that have considerably more than 20 or 40 channels, but they're rare. I think this will cover most needs that people will have short of something in the commercial space, and so that should be good. Okay, so that brings us into release 24, and release 24 is when things all got a bit rocky, and the main reason for that was we started to play with addressing performance. We've been increasingly seeing people with layouts which are getting up with significantly larger number of channels, and so both Dan and I have been playing with things which we're trying to improve the rendering speed. And there's two ways in which we're trying to do that, and both of them to varying degrees have caused us a few issues. Dan's set of changes relate to improving or increasing the amount of multi-threading. Now, xLights has always been multi-threaded. In fact, it's very multi-threaded. But during the render process, the way the multi-threading was previously working, particularly if you were doing sequencing on groups and models, you would often find that the progress of rendering on the models would get stuck behind the rendering on the groups. And so although you have all these threads in the computer, there was one thread that was doing all the work, and because it was doing all the work, yeah, all the other threads were waiting and not using all the CPU in your system. And so Dan's found a way to further break down, sorry, I'm just, things changing, further break down or break the process up into multiple threads, which you'll find will cause your CPU to run a lot heavier, but it will also complete its task a lot sooner. So, well, at least sooner. I think some of the early performance testing, and Dan's continued to make changes, but some of the early testing I did, there was at least a 10% saving if you just purely used, if I just purely ran it with Dan's changes, but then there were some additional changes on top of that I was doing, and that relates to something. So Dan's changes aren't visible at all in here, so I can't really show you that. But what I can show you is the render cache stuff. And so there's a couple of new menu items up here. One of them is the render cache. I've currently got it disabled. The other two modes are locked effects only and enable. Enable basically tries to cache as much as it can. Now, xLights is selective about what it caches because there's only, the way caching works, and let me turn it on and let me drop an effect on that does cache. I think the butterfly does. And let's go back into that show folder that we just created. Where are we? Lots of drop boxes. One there. Okay, it's the right folder. FGDG. Oh, sorry, I forgot. Nothing will cache until you've saved your sequence because you have to give it a name. So we have to save it, give it a name. And now what's happened is it's created this render cache folder. And so if I click on the effect to cause it to render, what it does is it writes into this folder a file, and that file is basically all of the data that this particular effect is created. And if I change the effect in any way, it will actually delete this file and recreate it with the new cache. And then when it comes time to do the rendering, when it gets to this effect, it will look in the cache, and if there is already a cached version of the effect, it will grab the data out of the cache and it will use that in the render all, rather than going back and recalculating all of the pixels from scratch. Now, for some effects, that makes no sense at all. And then we don't cache it. So if I was to throw an on effect on here, you won't see an on effect come up in here. And the reason for that is because it's actually quicker for us to just render the on effect than it would be for us to go into the cache and get the data and everything else. So you'll only see caches for things like butterfly and the plasma. I think the pinwheel does, the fan and the galaxy. The video definitely does. The old video cache has now been removed. I haven't actually cleaned up your files, so if you have any old video cache files, you can now go and delete them because xLights is no longer looking at those. And it will create those various files. And you can find that this makes a dramatic difference. In some sequences, I've seen it render as much as 10 times faster when you do a render all. It really depends on your mix of sequences. When I looked at my sequences from last year, my improvements were in the 30 to 50% range for a render all. But it does vary dramatically based on the mix of effects that you happen to have in your sequence. If for some reason, and this can happen particularly with upgrades, etc., sometimes the data that's in the render cache is just wrong. It's you know, there was a bug in an earlier version and you've still got all that data in there. And so there's two things that you can do when that happens. One is you can come to the effect and just change a parameter and change it back, and that will force it to go back and rewrite the cache for that particular effect. But you can also come up to the tools, purge render cache, and that will actually delete that entire cache for that sequence, and the next time you render it will then go back and recreate them. So that's what you should do if, you know, if it all just doesn't seem to be right and you're very confused about what's going on. Try purging the render cache and re-rendering it again. Now, the first time you render without the cache there, it will go back to taking however long it used to take, and in fact it can take slightly longer because of all of the writing to the cache files. So something to consider. But like I said, it can make a really big difference. It can be really worthwhile. Now, the other mode there that I showed you, which is the locked effects only. So if I now re-render this, which doesn't take long because it's fairly small. Sorry. I thought it would delete it, but it doesn't matter. So if I delete this, hang on. If I change that and then change it back. No. Yeah, let's delete it. So if I render that all again, notice how it didn't recreate it. And the reason for that is because the effect is not locked. And so when the render cache is set to locked effects only, what that will do is you'll have to come in here and lock the effect, and then it will create the render cache for that effect next time it gets rendered. The power of that is that allows you to then be more selective about what you cache. So if you want to control the items that get cached, you can just go in and lock those effects. Now remember, when you do a lock of an effect, it just stops you moving the effect around. It doesn't stop you changing its parameters, but it does stop you moving them around. And that can be quite useful if you're working on a big sequence, particularly if you've imported something and you know you don't want to touch anything on a model. Coming in, right-clicking on the model and saying select all the effects, and then right-clicking and locking them can be a really powerful way of making sure that you don't accidentally muck up an imported sequence where you don't want to. So that's the render cache. Hopefully some of you will see some real improvements out of both Dan's change and the render cache. Now the render cache definitely introduced some instability, and I have seen some bug reports that suggest that maybe there are a couple of situations where it's not generating the right result. You always have the option of turning it off if it's not doing things for you, and we'll continue to work through the things that are reported to us. Now, fixing transparent GIFs. This one also caused a lot of issues. GIF handling in our under handling library is fine for a static image, but when you get to animations, it does very little, and there's a bunch of work that we've had to do to try and work out how to get the transparent GIFs to work correctly. We were doing animations okay previously, but where a GIF had a transparent color in it, we weren't rendering those properly at all, and that was causing us issues, particularly when we use GIF with the image model, but also sometimes when you just want to display one. And so I've made some changes there to solve that problem. So now I can come in down here, grab a GIF. I think I have a GIF in here with transparency. Thought I did. Yeah, this one was one that was causing me grief. Scale it. Okay, and so that's actually transparent. If I was to throw something underneath it, like fire, you can see it renders correctly with the transparency. So that respects the transparency that's actually in the GIF. Now, in doing that, or in doing some of these changes, I've also correctly implemented the render to background, and that mostly works okay, but sometimes it generates some interesting results. So let me show you an example of that. So we'll put that one in, and we'll go to browse documents. So there is an image I've got here that has interesting challenges. this one here. So by default, I've defaulted it to turn the background off. But if you turn the GIF background on, you can see it renders quite oddly. That's actually the correct way that it's meant to render. It's meant to display the background. The background color happens to be white, and so that's how it is. So I've added the checkbox that lets you suppress it. So, and that actually defaults that way as well, because that's how it was effectively defaulting previously. So it shouldn't cause anyone any issues. It should all default out okay. But there is that extra option in there as well, just in case your GIF works a little bit differently. Escape key to cancel render all. This is kind of cool. So if, well, putting a video onto that doesn't make a lot of sense. So if I come into here, put that video on, click render all, you know, it takes a little while to render that. Now what I can do is, while it's rendering, if I click in the background and press the escape key, which I just did, it will actually cancel the render all and restore it back. So if you clicked render all and you're frustrated with it, you want to stop it and interrupt it, etc., you can now do that by making sure you click on the background here in the sequencer area and just press the escape key, and it will cancel the render all, and you can go back and do whatever it is that you want to do. Particularly helpful, I think, if you I think it would work if you do a save where you had render turned on and potentially press escape. If not, someone will have to report that and I'll go and fix it. Unmask. Oh my God, this unmask thing does my head in. What's the best way to show this? Let's throw an on effect down. And let's change the color of the on effect to be, I want to start it at black. I want it to go to white. I want it to go back to black. And then I want it to go to red. Actually, let's delete that one. All right. So that's the color. What we'll do is we will make that a spatial color curve. And then what I want to do is throw a pinwheel on top of it. And I want that to be one is an unmask. Sorry, yeah, one is unmask, and make it thick. That is, oh, hang on, I'll get rid of the color. Okay, so that's how one is unmasked has always worked. It's not how it was working for a while in versions 24 through 26 or 25 or whenever it was that I reworked it. So to me, this is not an unmask. It's not an unmask because while the pinwheel has unmasked and is showing the underlying effect, you can see that in unmasking it, it's lost all of those complicated gradients that actually sat in the underlying color. And where it was black, it's actually white underneath, which just makes no sense to me. And so what I've done, and so what I did was I tried to make changes to one is unmasked to get it to be a true unmask. And I made one change and it worked for the things that I was testing with, but then Gil pointed out to me that as you went away from pure black, it started to do weird things again. So I then went back and changed it again, and I moved one is unmasked back to its original functionality, which is not really unmasked. And so I created a true unmask. And this is a true unmask. And to me, this is what an unmask should actually do. You can see that the underlying colors here are as exactly as they were for the on effect, when the on effect did not have any mask over the top of it. And then the pinwheel is basically, wherever the pinwheel isn't black, it's unmasking the underlying color. Now, people, and I had someone report a bug to me today saying, oh, this is not right. And the reason that they thought it wasn't right, let me go in here and make this white again. and let me select that color. So you can see here when it goes away, actually I need to copy this. So here's the pinwheel if I make it normal. Okay, so it's white. Now what happens, however, if I make that 3D? Okay, how do you think that's going to work? Well, the way in which thought that was going to work is that it would bring that out using a blend, and you'd get that sort of softened border around it. But of course, in practice, that's not actually what happens with an unmask. If I make that 3D, notice how it makes really no difference at all to the mask. And the reason is because it unmasks wherever it's not pure black, and all of that grayness that exists on the edge of those blades, it's not actually pure black. And so consequently, this is actually the right answer. This is exactly what an unmask should do. It's not a blend. If you want to do a blend, you would use an entirely different outcome. You'd use something like a, I don't know, something like a minimum is probably more like what he was looking for. Anyway, I digress. So yes, that generated, I think, a bit of noise because things started to look a little bit different, but I'm pretty happy with where it's at again now. Okay, sample warp mode. Okay, so this is something I added. Let's grab our butterfly, move it down a layer. Oh, it's locked. That's why it didn't move. Unlock and move. All right, let's throw a morph on top of it. So not morph, a warp. And let's change it to the new sample on. And you can see what this does is it sets the entire prop to a single color. And it does that by basically using the X and Y coordinates to sample a point inside the butterfly, and then it makes everything that color. Why? Well, partly because I can, although I also suspect that this might be useful as we move into 3D, which is kind of why I do it. So how do I know it works? Well, if you move it down to the 0, 0 coordinate, in which in the butterfly is always red, you can see it does exactly what you'd expect it to do. It makes the whole prop red. So it is working, but it's a way to sample a point in an underlying effect and then making the whole prop that color. So you can use the underlying effect as the driver of the color of the result of the warp. Anyway, let's keep going. Exclusion of channels in X-Fade. Let's come back to that. A refresh button to FPP Connect. So there's a couple of changes that have been made in FPP Connect. One is there was recently a bug where the XML files here would stop appearing if you had set your FSCQ files to be in a location that was different to your show folder / sequence folder. That's now been fixed. And in this case, the refresh is up here where Scott's added the refresh button. So if you plug your USB stick in after the dialog box comes up, you can click the refresh button and it will obviously reread the list of drives and find your USB stick, and you can copy your sequences onto the USB stick using the FPP upload. I'm willing to bet most people don't even realize that this exists, but when you've got a bunch of sequences and you don't want to send it over the network, and it's easy to pop the USB stick out, you can just stick it into the computer, and this thing is smart enough to know whereabouts on the USB stick and what names things should have in order to work. So yeah, it's a little utility for that. So that's those two. Remove flag that prevents effects grid paste until a copy has been performed. So a number of people have run into this. If you're copying effects from two sequences, so you fire up two versions of xLights, you copy a bunch of effects from one instance of xLights, you go to the other one and you try and paste them and it won't let you paste them. This change here basically allows you to then directly paste them, so it solves that problem. Okay, so This one here, okay, so this one here has also been a cause of a bunch of instability. It relates, well, it relates primarily to value curves on buffers. So actually, let's not use that. Let's use a spirals because it demonstrates it a little better. So if you come up to sub-buffers and you edit them, you can put value curves here. And so I can make the buffer go like this. And so the spiral starts at the beginning and grows up, and in fact it grows up well beyond the height. This wasn't working properly. It was doing two things. In some of the older versions it was actually crashing, and even when it stopped crashing it still wasn't working properly, and it's taken me and Dan as well today several releases to try and get all of the use cases sorted out. It shouldn't crash anymore. There's still a risk that we haven't found a particular use case, and consequently it renders slightly wrong or slightly differently. I'm hoping we've got it right. We have tested a whole bunch of things, but you just never know. Sometimes the number of options that are there and the number of ways in which it can be used, we struggle to find all the examples and fix them up. The new save icons you would have noticed up here, these are back to a sensible set of reasonably industry standard icons for new open save and save as. I definitely like them better than the old up and down arrows, so that's a good thing. Add back the start parameter sign-based value curves. Okay, so this is, and I can't really show this very easily, but in the sign for a couple of releases now, in fact quite a few releases now, I'd remove this first parameter. It used to be used to move the curve left and right, and I removed it because there's this parameter down here which, as you see, seems to do the same thing. The problem is it didn't, and what would happen is this would be stuck at 0, and then you'd start playing with this, and what would happen is you'd get this disjointed sine curve. And yeah, I couldn't come up with an easy way to resolve it, and so I've moved the start. I've reintroduced the start parameter. I've left the time offset there because it's useful, but I have reintroduced the start parameter as well. The way the cycles worked is, oh, actually, there it is there. See how it becomes disconnected, but if you come up to here, it doesn't, and that's why. The way it works is if this is if your cycles is a multiple of 10, I think it is, it's all perfect and you wouldn't notice the difference. But as soon as you get your cycles outside a value of 10, you get this discontinuity in the sine wave, and consequently the time offset becomes no longer equivalent to the start, and so consequently I've reintroduced the start parameter, etc., for those people that wanted that, and stops a couple of sequences breaking. So that's what that one's all about. This was more of Dan introducing parallel rendering. So you can see there's a bunch of effects there whose algorithms have been updated to take advantage of multi-threaded rendering. So not only does the effect render on its own thread, but the effect actually uses multiple CPUs to render. So again, it should render faster, and having more CPUs in your machine is increasingly becoming useful. For a while there, having extra CPUs kind of helped, but it only helped if you sequence purely at the model level. You'd see huge benefits from multiple CPUs, but if you were sequencing at the group level, etc., you didn't get that sort of benefit, and you'd often find that only one core was really running hot, and the rest were largely sitting around waiting. Finally, let's quickly do this one, and then we'll jump over to Xfade briefly. If you come in here and do a faces, and let's go and add a couple of faces. We'll add number 1. We'll make it a matrix face. We'll download a matrix face. I don't know. It's ugly, but whatever. Well, we'll insert that. There it all is. Let's go up. Let's add another matrix face. We'll call this number 2. And we'll download another one. Oh no, Casper the Ghost looks like a good thing. Again, not a great face, but whatever. Okay, so we've done that, and then what I'll do is I'll go into the submodels and let's generate this, and let's just create 2 vertical slices, left and right. Okay, so left and right, looks good. We'll click save. Now the problem was previously, if I wanted to put one face on one side and one face on the other, by opening up the matrix and finding those 2 submodels, it wouldn't work, and you would have to go up and drop it actually on the matrix and then actually apply a sub buffer to it. Now what you can do is you can come down to here and you can say, yep, I want to put that face definition is 1 or 2. There's 1. Not sure why it doesn't work the first time, but it doesn't. And then I can come to the other side and I can choose face definition 2, and I can now do face effects on the submodels, accessing the face definitions on the overarching model, but they probably get scaled to the submodels. So makes things a little bit easier. You don't have to spend a lot of time going and creating a whole bunch of sub buffers on these effects in order to get them to work that way. So I know a couple of people have asked, why doesn't it work that way? Well, now it does. All right, so let's quickly jump back to xFade. So that's in. Let's see, program files, xLights, xFade. All right, so what's happened here is in configure, I've now added these channel fade exclude. And what this lets you do is sometimes when if you're controlling, right? So xFade, the idea of xFade is you have 2 versions of xLights, and it allows you to switch between effects on each version and do crossfading and all of that sort of stuff. Now, some of the things that you're controlling that way might be things where you don't actually want to fade between the 2 values, and instead what you want to do is, as the effects fade from one side to the other, you actually want to hold the value the same, and when you get to the midpoint, you just want to flip the value over to be the value on the other side. And that's what this channel fade exclude does. It does 2 things. It stops the, cancel this. It stops the brightness sliders up here from impacting on those channels. So any channels that you've configured in that list, it will not fade them at all. And when this slider slides across, when it's on the left-hand side here, no matter where it is on the left-hand side, anywhere short of middle, it will use whatever value was in here and not change it at all. It will just output that value. And as you cross over the 50% mark, it will switch over and use the value from this side. And again, it won't change the value at all. It will output whatever value happened to be on that channel. So it lets you it basically gives you that ability to have these channels which are not impacted by the brightness and not impacted by the cutover piece. So if you had some dumb AC channels, etc., you might choose to do that as well. And that's it. So, what I haven't shown you here is the massive list of bug fixes that have been going in. Many of them are related to the prior releases, as we've sort of chopped and changed and tried to sort out this accelerated rendering, the render cache, and solving some problems with the way those resizable buffers were working, and some anomalies in there has created a whole bunch of uncertainty. As at the morning, it looks pretty good. We're probably going to jump over, spend a bit more time on 3D right now. I'd like to get a beta running pretty soon, and we'll be posting shortly in the official xLights group to let people know what it will take for you to participate in that. So thank you guys, and we'll talk next time.